Hi, thank you for joining us for our conversation about the legislative session and community engagement. I'm Denise Diskin. I am the co-executive director of litigation and strategy at QLaw Foundation of Washington. My pronouns are she, her. QLaw Foundation of Washington is an organization that provides free legal services and systemic advocacy with our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit IA plus communities all over the state of Washington. In my role in community is also that I've been out for about 25 years and have been doing LGBTQ 2S plus advocacy for about 15 years and really honored to do work with QLaw Foundation in our communities every day. So we're going to start with some introductions, and I'm going to kick it first to Lee.
Hi, my name is Lee. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a member of QLaw, which is a community advisory board under QLaw.
Great. What's your role in community, Lee?
I wear many hats in community. In addition to being on QLaw for the last year or so, I also do some additional community organizing through various channels, and generally I'm just like a queer out and about town.
I love that. Alice, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Atlas Fernandez. I use they, them pronouns, and I giggle because we decided on PCLAC. I was going to say Community Action Advisory Board. But yes, I serve as part of the advisement and the critical questioning for QLaw's strategy and the programs that they roll out. In community, I am also very nosy. I like to ask why. I like to see who is and who isn't at the table. And aside from also participating on this advisory board, I work at a nonprofit that focuses on equitable housing, education, and health access.
Awesome. Thanks, Atlas.
Oh, me?
Yes,
Yeah, I'm Rebekah Gardea. I use she and her pronouns, and I work for QLaw Foundation with Denise. I'm the co-executive director of community advocacy and outreach. I am proudly not an attorney, so that is something that I boast in the organization, and I think that's really important because often folks that are a part of organizations, especially who hold like positions of power, they're often the ones that are they're on one end of that spectrum, right? They're not on the receiving end of services. And so as somebody who comes in with a background in education and not as an attorney, I kind of offer the lens as community member in trying to really ensure that the services, the legal services that we provide as, QLaw Foundation of Washington to our community is something that really fits the needs of our community. And the only way that we can do that is by really ensuring that community voice is something that is informing our policies, our practices, and our programs. So like a core part of that role that we're going to be talking about today is bridging community voice to really making changes. And so we'll be talking a little bit about like changes in our systems versus like changes in our organization. And so yeah, I get to work with our community advisory board members because by virtue of their lived experience, like those are the folks who navigate accessing services. Those are the folks with the lived experience. And so they bring a lot of wisdom and expertise that we so need, not even just in like small organizations, but in like our overarching institutions and systems. So yeah, and the other arm of what we do that I'll be talking a lot about today is the legislative session. Because, in addition to offering legal services, we also do legislative advocacy. And I just want to name right now that in addition to not being an attorney, I am not a person with a strong policy background. Many people who hold these positions in organizations have been, they have a policy background or they are, the policy director. That's not knowledge that I held prior to coming into QLaw a year and a half ago. That's something that I really had to learn quickly. And so, part of the importance in that is that through legislative advocacy, you're really trying to help ensure that we are, making laws that help our communities and don't cause harm. And I think that's really important that we engage in that. It's really essential that we involve community voice in it. And I'm very new to legislative advocacy, but I'm already seeing the gaps in these systems and the ways that members of our communities don't feel like they have agency and voice in it. And so, yeah, I'm just really eager to kind of take a look at this legislative session and some of the successes and, you know, some of the losses that we experienced and where I see community being so essential and where they're just being intentionally left out. And I want to kind of defer to our community members here today to kind of offer some insights on what's missing and how can we build like cross-community solidarity in order to ensure that we have good legislation that it helps to liberate us instead of just perpetuating harm.
Yeah. So what we'll do then is we'll talk a little bit about kind of recapping what we encountered, right, in the session, what we achieved, what we didn't achieve, some reflections on that, and then talk a little bit more with Lee and Atlas. So let's talk a little bit about how the legislative session went and do some reflecting. Rebekah, why don't you, I'm going to borrow your phrase, why don't you give us a little bit of a drunk history recap of the 2024 legislative session that we just finished?
Oh yeah, it was a fast, it was a time. I got dragged this session. Okay, so I just want to give some context. So Denise is referring to me using the term drunk history because, like I said, I am not a policy expert. I do not claim owning any sort of proficiency in talking about the legislative session with like confidence and fluency, but I see that as a value add because like I said, I hold the lens as so many community members do in experiencing these like coded language when it comes to processes in society like the legislative session. And so as I learn it, right, this is my second legislative session. I went through one last winter as it happens every year. And I'm learning as I'm going. But my ability to like re-articulate my understanding of the legislative session is very much like drunk history, the show. So I'm not going to get it right all the time. But to give my drunk history kind of recap on this session, it's a short session, so it went by real fast. So just like as a quick overview, legislative session is really how, you know, to get to the schoolhouse, is it Schoolhouse Rock? No.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I dated myself there with that reference, right? But it's, I honestly, I had to relook at that before my interview. I was like, how's this process? They make it seem so easy. It's easy to know that it needs to start in one chamber, go to the other, right, in order to like pass through and become a law, but there's so many details that are actually really important for folks to know about. And I would say, not being a policy specialist, I bring in the knowledge that community brings into this, that it's really confusing. There's a lot of coded language there. There's a lot of like structural things that you have to pay attention to in terms of deadlines. And yeah, so the second year in the 2-year biennium is a short session. Long sessions are 105 days. The short sessions are 60 days. So it felt like a whirlwind this session, and we really pushed to pass really critical bills that would help our community to mitigate harm. And we had some really big successes this year. But I'll be real, I'm really heartbroken that 2 of our most important bills this session did not pass. And so the ones that didn't pass this year were around health equity and around housing, things that arguably impact all of our communities here in Washington State. But, you know, some of the things to celebrate this year is that we, you know, we're able to secure employee rights. We have a paid sick leave bill that's inclusive to folks who hold like diverse relationships. And so that's like an important one for our community, as well as this captive audience bill. So it's really ensuring that employees do not have to be subjected to their boss's religious or a political agenda, which might seem like you don't really have to think about it, but for our rural siblings in an election year, that's really, really critical. Right. And then additionally, we have this inclusive curriculum bill, so ensuring that LGBTQ and Two-Spirit folks are represented in our public school curriculum and their history. It's like mandated that their histories are being told, which is, you know, a necessary and affirming experience for all students. So that was a win to celebrate this year. But one I'm going to really be talking about is the strippers or workers bill, which is we are trying to aggressively force over the finish line. It's awaiting the governor's signature as we speak, and that's something that I want to do kind of a deeper dive in talking about, because we saw something like really critical happen with the strippers or workers bill that I think really helped the success this year. But what I'm looking into is like the communities that really showed up for the stripper bill, which ensures safer working conditions for those in working in strip clubs in Washington State, which is something that affects many communities of folks, especially like in our queer, trans, women communities, in our BIPOC communities. So yeah, I want to kind of take a quicker look at like what made that bill so successful, because I'm so curious, like why couldn't we bring that together with something like health equity or something like, you know, rent stabilization? Yeah, so.
Right, so really looking at the clues of what made the strippers or workers bill effective, despite significant opposition, significant misunderstanding of what workers' rights within strip clubs actually look like for those employees. And like, why didn't it work for a rent stabilization bill? Why didn't it work for a bill that would have protected our health equity statewide, right? So examining kind of those background factors. Before we do that though, I want to get a sense of from you of like, now you've made it through your second session, right? Like, whew, and like the 60-day sessions are a doozy. We had closer relationships with some legislators than we ever have before, learned more about those written and unwritten parts of the process than we ever have before. But tell me some of your thoughts about like, how does community fit into this, right? Like, because legislative session, like it's, you know, there's many ways to get to our goals in organizing. Legislative session is only one, right? And so what about that, what lessons learned from that, or what insights from that about community engagement challenges or options, availabilities, opportunities do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that I want to talk from my own like kind of personal experience and knowledge, right? My level of civic engagement prior to working at QLaw was super limited to figuring out who we elect. So it like places a lot of like responsibility in our elected officials. And I really didn't engage with the legislative session because I really wasn't taught the tools to engage. I can't necessarily thank my public school education for that or my family, you know, but my only knowledge was like who we vote for. And my appreciation for that admittedly is dwindling. And I think that many of our marginalized communities can probably relate, because it's really hard to have such high expectations of the folks that you vote for and then not see changes in the law or not see our communities become more liberated, right? And so it was interesting for me with that kind of lens to start doing this work and to learn about the legislative session, because I see that community voice is essential in passing bills, right? Like many of these bills, they might come from organizations, but they can come from individual people who are experiencing harm, who are identifying like, hey, I'm not the only one experiencing harm in this way. Let's use our collective voice to meet with folks who can help kind of, you know, walk alongside us as we figure out how to connect with legislators in between the legislative session happening, and then share our concerns as constituents, as voting constituents here, about what's happening to us. And so sometimes that influences, you know, bills getting drafted and it going into the legislative session and becoming a law. And so I see that as being really necessary for our communities to know about, and I think it's just something that's not widely held knowledge, probably intentionally. And so, yeah, there are some ways for folks to engage right during the session, and it's, you know, as bills are having hearings, either in the House or the Senate, folks can sign up and give testimony and share their experience with legislators to try to influence a decision being made on a bill. They can also, if they don't want to, I can understand how that can be kind of scary for community members, especially those who have been caused systemic harm. They can actually not provide testimony, but instead sign in favor or in opposition to a bill. Or they can meet with community organizations like ours to kind of share their experience. And that's kind of how we engage in the legislative session. So Denise and I craft testimony, and we either sign up to give it during hearings or we submit it. But really, we're not doing that as ourselves, right? We're doing that because of what we're hearing in our legal clinics or what community members are directly sharing with us. But it's challenging because even doing it online, you would think, oh, the easy click of the button. You have to have the skills to know when things are happening in the session. You have to click so many things. You have to know, I mean, even when I'm tracking, I'll try to make it really easy and I'll put it up online. Like if you just click here, you can sign in, and then I'll get people DMing me like, oh, the link isn't working, Rebekah. And I'm scrambling to try to make it as easy as possible, because if I left a list of instructions for how folks should be able to sign in, it's seemingly simple, but it's too much, right?
Yeah, it's like jumping through flaming hoops to like get to that destination on the website. And then also, I think we talked a lot about like the timing, right? Of like that you think you have kind of a good understanding of what's going to be in front of the legislature for the session at the start. I mean, you started reviewing bills the first week of December, and legislation didn't start till like the first week of January. And even then there were things that were popping up, or like, oh, this committee's going to have a hearing at 8 a.m. on, 3 days from now, and, trying to sort of scramble. So there's all of these sort of systemic challenges, and I feel like we encountered some unwritten rules. But before we spend too much time talking about the difficulties in accessing the legislature, I want to hear a little bit more. You mentioned our critical bills this session, the Keep Our Care Act, which was the health equity and access around the state, rent stabilization, and the Strippers or Workers bill. Can you share a little bit about why we prioritized those particular bills, what made them important to our communities, and what happened with them?
Yeah. Well, one that really is, I'll start with the Keep Our Care Act. The Keep Our, I'll be honest, I'm really gutted about this one. Yeah. And it took me a long time to even have the fluency to be able to talk about how this impacts our communities, but it impacts it in big ways. But the short and sweet of it is this bill would ensure that there is oversight taking place when mergers happen within, our hospital systems in Washington state.
Right. So when like Providence bought Swedish, when Franciscan merged with Virginia Mason, those kinds of things. Yeah, and here in Washington state, those are so prolific, they happen all the time. There's no oversight to them happening. So often it's about profit margins and not about the quality of healthcare. And so what that actually does for folks, especially from our most marginalized communities and in our queer communities that we know near and dear, is it actually decreases the quality of healthcare. It decreases access to services. It increases the cost. And so, we were seeing harms from these mergers happening even in places in proximity to Seattle, but then you put that in the context of like our rural communities, like further east, folks are having to drive for like hours to get the care that they need, specifically around abortion and reproductive health care and gender affirming care. And so what this bill would have done is it ensures that there's some oversight taking place, that when a merger is going to happen or a consolidation is going to happen, that it's going to ensure that our healthcare gets better and not worse. And I think this is its fourth session. It's trying to pass this into law, and last year it made it really far. But part of what happens in that process is amendments can be made, and often when we see amendments happen, they could. I would say often we're seeing amendments that make the bill weaker. And so that's what we saw with the Keep Our Care Act in the 2023 legislative session. And so folks leading this campaign at Pro-Choice Washington and the ACLU and Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates and Gender Justice League, they did a lot of work to ensure the strength of this bill. And we got it further than it's ever been before, but on the final day of session, or I should say, this is where my fluency isn't great, final day of session was Friday. A week before that was the cutoff where these bills needed to go to the floor for a vote or be pulled, right?
and it didn't happen.
It was like the last one in line.
Yeah.
It was like next to be debated on the floor, I remember, because we were texting each other that Friday night going, are they gonna come back from caucus and talk about this? Are we gonna watch the debate? Are we gonna have a vote?
Yeah, and yeah, with bated breath, we waited on Friday, and then we got the unfortunate news that it didn't get pulled and that it was dead. I mean, and the phrase they use in the legislative session is "a bill is dead," and so that's it. And so it was just really heartbreaking to know that we got it further than it could have ever gotten, but ultimately, why it wasn't successful was because Washington hospital associations got into the ears of legislators and into private practice doctors, it sounds like, and kind of did some fear mongering in order to protect consolidations being, rampant in Washington state. And
Yeah, this idea that you're not going to be able to make money on a merger of your practice, and small communities really being led to believe that this will harm their access to healthcare, when actually oversight just means let's make sure that the folks who live in Wenatchee or Yakima or Sequim or wherever have access to the care that they need in their communities, and that it's not dictated by profit margins and population, right? Like it's so hard to have such an ideological difference.
yeah, so we were heartbroken about that one, and we were equally as heartbroken about our second top priority bill, which was around rent stabilization. House Bill 2114, I believe was its number. And rent stabilization is something so needed. I think all of us renters can attest that it has been a brutal experience to be at the mercy of your landlord, right? And I mean, Denise, you'll have to. So what this rent stabilization bill would have done is it would have made it so that landlords could not increase your rent. I think the original bill was they couldn't increase your rent over 5%.
Yeah, and then it got backed up to 7, and I can't remember honestly where it landed, but
Yeah, and we couldn't even give public testimony. I signed up to give public testimony for that bill because that's, we hear what our clients and our community members have to navigate at the mercy of their landlords and who are subjected to the market. And we signed up to give testimony, and I didn't even get called to do it because there are so many community members who had signed up to share their heartbreaking, oops, I need to not touch the mic, but sorry. They shared their heartbreaking experience of how often they have to move and what are the impacts. The impacts is that if you have to move so frequently to try to keep your rent down because your landlord keeps arbitrarily increasing it by 10% or more, you're having to move often. You're having to move further away from your jobs, further away from your communities.
right.
And for our most marginalized communities members, this is unacceptable, right? And yeah, it was hard to see how many community members showed up to give testimony, but then you have, apartment complex managers or property management companies and all these other folks, instead of calling it rent stabilization, calling it, what were they inaccurately calling it? They were inaccurately referring to it as, oh my gosh, rent control.
Oh, yeah.
Which it's not a rent control bill. It was simply putting a cap on being able to increase rent. And despite so many community members sharing their experience, the bill didn't pass. And yeah, it's disheartening to me to kind of look at that bill and the health equity bill and wonder, I'm not wondering why, but it's very clear that the voices do not weigh equally at the legislature. And I want to be able to trust in our legislators' ability to use an equity lens to recognize who are the most disempowered constituents voicing their concerns in these hearings and in their outreach. And in their sign-ins, and can they ever weigh those voices more?
Right. So let's talk about the strippers or workers bill, and that one was a success. And I think I think there's a lot of factors that led to that. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what you saw different in that campaign that contributed to the success versus some of the campaigns that weren't successful?
Yeah, gosh, there were so many things that made it successful, but I will say, the campaign work there was so strong, and I think why it was so strong is it was being led by folks with lived experience. The campaign lead was a former dancer A lot of the folks who were speaking from their lived experience of, being empowered as dancers at strip clubs, but, not having any agency into ensuring their workplace safety because of several regulations that are here in Washington State, but are not, taking place in some of our neighboring states like Oregon, around alcohol prohibition. And yeah, so they were the folks who were able to say, our workplace is not safe because the sole source of, we as dancers are the sole source of revenue at strip clubs. And so if you are not allowed to serve alcohol and the sole source of revenue is the dancers, you're not going to be able to afford workplace basics like security and many other workplace basics that are super necessary. And so they led that campaign work, and they did a phenomenal job and brought in, the folks with the lived experience, those folks who have the expertise to know what the solutions to their problems are without having to rely on larger organizations to do that work for them. So that was a huge success in their campaign. But there was actually something else that happened that was kind of interestingly, it was very timely, that I think also kind of contributed to the success of the stripper bill. And so that was the Liquor Cannabis Board raids on our local Cap Hill gay bars that had taken place during the legislative session that I feel really brought an awareness to our community members around the deep intersections of who is impacted by these outdated laws that they don't just affect our strip clubs, they affect many things. Denise, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can talk about, when we think about organizing a campaign, when we think about bringing people with lived experience to the table, right? What I think was significant in that is that, there was the lived experience-led campaign, and then there was this set of events, right, where Liquor and Cannabis Board and the Seattle Police Department's joint enforcement team that they share with Liquor and Cannabis Board did enforcement activity. Some people call it raiding, I'm open to many terms to describe it, going into establishments that are historically queer and trans spaces, right, on Capitol Hill, and doing their joint enforcement work, right? And I think for our communities, it's really activating, and it activates a really deep history when a team of 10 dudes in suits and cops show up in your bar, right? And I think that moment and that sort of those historical trauma echoes really brought a connection between the experiences of dancers in those clubs and also other clubs, right? And those people whose job is to be the entertainment in that space, very reliant on tips and things like that. And it sort of brought into alignment the risks that both groups of people share, right? Both the patrons of establishments that are historically queer establishments, sometimes establishments where, there's a lot of things that go on that are, these are community spaces in many ways, and establishments where maybe not necessarily queer community are also engaging in sexualized spaces, right? And all of those things are things that we have freedom and agency to do. But I think that the alignment there with that historical sort of trauma really brought a lot of people into this movement who might not have otherwise, I'm sure if you ask people, do you care about the rights of strippers, they would say yes, but they're not going to see themselves as personally invested. And then suddenly we had this historical trauma activated for white cis gay men, right? White cis lesbians, right? Who don't necessarily see themselves aligned with sex work in any way, suddenly feeling oh no, we are sharing a common threat. And I think that was a really activating moment. Now, I will give Liquor and Cannabis Board credit that they did, honestly, the fastest reversal I've ever seen a state agency do. We'll see if it sticks. We're holding them accountable, right? This is not a one-moment deal, but they really immediately shifted policies around that. But I think what was great was the alignment had already been made, right? So the alignment of having someone like, white cis gay men leaders in our community, owners of these clubs, right, engaging in direct action, like the cuff papered the apology letter to the side of their building, right? Like you have these moments of direct action, then the alignment had already been made. And so I thought that was a really powerful galvanizing moment. But I also feel a little bit of cynicism about it, right? Because it's like, well, was our community, our community as a white cis queer person, right? Was our community really showing up for these people before? And like, or was it just because suddenly our skin was in the game, right? And so really like making sure that those alliances last and that they become genuine relationships, I think to me seems like the next challenge.
Yeah. And Denise, I feel like you said that, you've mentioned something similar. I guess a similar concern or hope, like, are we going to stay in alignment? Are you going to continue to do this work? I feel like you've seen that in the past with marriage equality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, that's why for me, the Liquor and Cannabis Board moment felt positive, but also felt a little scary because I think, I've been out for 25 years, right? And I was blessed that I came out into a community that was like 60, 70% trans people, which is wild for like 1999, right? Like, and so my mentors have really been folks who were kind of on the margins of the movements of the early 2000s, where, there was a huge rift in LGBTQ advocacy work over employment equality, right? The Equality Act, right? When it was first introduced in 2000 something early aughts-ish. And there was this rift between major LGBTQ advocacy organizations that wanted to move forward with LGB protections in the Equality Act and take an incremental gain, and advocacy organizations that would not move forward without everybody, including the T and the Q and the I and the A and everybody else, right? And so I think that was sort of a moment, and I'm very glad that what ended up happening was that the political momentum really shifted towards inclusion of everyone. But I think in marriage equality, unfortunately, we took some steps backward, right? Because it was a very like, we're just like everyone else kind of a movement. And I don't think that that's actually a strength-based position for our community, right? And it's not a coalition-based position for our community because many of us are not like everyone else, right? Right? We're not like the white heteronormative kind of ideal. And I think marriage equality was really built around this idea of like, we're already in your communities and you are safe from our strangeness, right? And instead was about, it could have been about, we all are humans, we all have value, we all deserve love, we all deserve family structures, we all deserve self-autonomy around those family structures. And so I think, what I really saw in marriage equality was, don't worry, we'll come back for you, right? And I think what we saw was in that time, and this was also 2000, early aughts to 2015 when we got the U.S. Supreme Court decision, we heard over and over and over again, don't worry, we'll come back for you. Don't worry, we'll start talking about housing again. Don't worry, we'll talk about trans healthcare. Don't worry, we'll talk about prison rates. Don't worry, we'll talk about over-policing. We just have to get this nailed down first. And then it got nailed down in 2015. And where are we, right? Like several of the organizations that were very well funded through that campaign are gone, including some in Washington. They're, some are trying to rebuild now, but like that, that money that was pouring into that campaign, it wasn't present in coalition building for rent stabilization, which what we see in our legal clinics is a deep inequity, a deep safety risk for our communities, right? Something that I think all of us at this table have experienced, right? Of like moving year after year, worrying about, how much your landlord is going to raise the rent because it's going up so much farther than inflation, and inflation is going up so much farther than our wages. And, it's like everything rolls downhill onto us, and yet we don't see investment in things like rent stabilization.
Yeah.
right? In a way that incorporates the voices of our communities and in a way that really brings that sort of, more mainstream marriage equality oriented LGB, whatever you want to call it, portion of our community that is financially secure doesn't bring into alignment with the people in our community who still aren't. And I'll also say with marriage equality, one big miss was disability rights, right? That like, because of the structure of disability benefit programs, people with disabilities who are using those government programs still can't get married without risking the loss of their benefits, right? Because, you join your income and then suddenly your income calculation is different, right? And I remember litigating that question in Washington State for a lesbian couple where they, one parent was on disability, was pregnant with twins. The other parent was not being counted as a member of their household, so their access to those disability benefits was off. And they didn't, we had to fight for them to get the Medicaid coverage that they needed to care for these twins that were arriving any day, And that's just like, we saw that in marriage equality, but we didn't see that progress happen with disability rights. And I think that that's where we have that coalition building to do, right? That it's never just one group, that it's really these other, so many other groups are being impacted by the same things. And we just have to sort of think with networks in mind instead of isolated stories.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to talk about the idea of coalition building because that's what is lingering in my mind right now as I think about the things that I'm upset about around the Keep Our Care Act and the housing bill not passing. And as I think about what led to the success of the stripper bill, but it was really like so many communities coming together, realizing like, wow, this impacts all of us. And going back to that, it's like, okay, are we going to continue this fight? Are we going to continue to build some like cross-community solidarity and use that momentum? And, it was really beautiful to see Madison, who was leading the Strippers or Workers bill. I was, fortunate to be able to meet with her and the massage parlors outreach program to talk about, addressing the other, rights that sex workers should be entitled to. And it was really great to be in space with them because it's ensuring that there's more work to be done and that we're actually going to be doing that by being in conversation with one another and not working separately and not working in silo. And like the last thing I'll say, it is really beautiful, is I feel like the language of the stripper bill shifted. I feel like folks were really wary to use the term sex work when we're talking about the stripper bill at the very beginning of its campaign. And I feel like the note that we're kind of ending on is that we're going to come back and we're going to keep expanding rights and protections for folks who should be protected. Right. And it's not just limited to folks who are in strip clubs. It should be expanded to everybody. And so I'm hopeful with the stripper bill. I mean, we got to get it over the finish line, but I'm really hopeful that this hopefully opens up the door for some more solidarity building. But I want to figure out, how can we replicate that in health equity? How can we replicate that in housing justice? And I don't necessarily have the answers alone, so I'm excited to kind of pick the brains of our, amazing community advisory board members who also experience issues in these, sectors. Yeah. So, should I turn it over now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, I want to expand this beyond the legislative session because I also recognize that people don't engage with the legislative session because, either they're not familiar with it, they don't see an avenue for their voice to be heard, or they're disillusioned because they've tried in the past and they haven't seen successes. So I'm curious, Atlas and Lee, like, what are some of the issues that are most important to the communities that you are a part of?
I can start off. So as I mentioned before, I work at an organization that the purpose is to create equitable access to housing, healthcare, and education. And as I myself have been able to gain steady access to housing, I see that that is still a very prevalent issue, especially when, I work for a nonprofit because I guess reckon with my proximity to whiteness and how that makes me feel and how I stand in community often, but I understand that that is also, it's not only taxing, but it's so crushing. And I oftentimes, like, I see my counterparts or I see my community members, I'm like, delusion and removing myself from it, or maybe just focusing on a project. I understand, and I don't question why it is that you lead your life in a different way. But the question still remains, how will you get equitable access to housing that makes sense in this state? How will you keep housed after you get a gender liberation process? How will you pay for that gender liberation process? How will you move on up in this world after you access who you want to be? And only to come to face with either organizations that don't really want to see you as who you are, or that don't allow you access to explore who you are. Coalition building makes me really confused, but as I hear you speak about being active in the legislative session, it makes me think like, oh yeah, in a way that is coalition building, because while my ear is not to the ground on what's happening in legislative session, someone is, and you're able to communicate that, and you're able to like be like, okay, I know that this isn't important to you in this regard, but if you can show up here, that's going to be really important for the effect of the overall community, and it's going to have the biggest impact. And I feel like in that way, it is very much like, okay, I have the ball here, you don't need to catch it. Keep on doing with what you're doing and creating equitable access with ways that you can, and I'll have it here, and when it's time to call me in, call me in.
Yeah, I think, like Atlas so eloquently put, housing is such a huge issue for so many people in my circles, and there's a number of other issues that I think intersect with housing that are important to me right now. As a disabled person, a chronically ill person, I think access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, good quality healthcare, non-judgmental healthcare, healthcare where people have a lot of autonomy over their own bodies, their own embodiment is critically important. And we're seeing a lot of that under attack right now. And that's a huge issue, I think, especially because whether people want to confront it or not, like the pandemic is still happening. We're still living through a mass disabling event, and more people are going to have complex health issues while having reduced access to care or continued decreased quality of care, like Rebekah was saying, with the healthcare bill that died. And so, for me, that's a huge concern. And also, like, issues, I see like so many of these issues like intersecting, really concerned about youth safety. And also something that has, I think, been important to BIPOC communities for a really long time, and now is coming up for more people with like different intersections, but also is just like over policing and state surveillance is becoming more and more of an issue for more people as well. And I think, to connect that back to coalition building, I think it's like nonprofits and so many organizing groups focus on single issues when the reality is these issues like housing, healthcare, over policing, all do connect. So it's like, how do you find the connected interest among kind of disparate voices, especially knowing like the nonprofit climate around funding and things like that, to build better community and better connections to work towards the common goals that benefit the most people and also lift up the most marginalized people.
Not that this is an answer, but I guess like an observation. The scarcity mindset created in nonprofit sectors because of limited funding and organizations that are able to do the work and impact community, like that, I see that replicating itself when when queer and trans folks are able to access healthcare liberating procedures, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, I have what I have, and I'm gonna keep it real close to me. And either you stop resource sharing, you stop showing up, you stop advocating, and then there's this divide that grows. And I don't know what to do opposite of that. It's like I can continue to show up how I'd like to be treated. I can continue to save my energy where I need to save it. That's not gonna do anything to make you change your mind. because you got what you got, and that's all you wanted.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point, Atlas. Just in the gatekeeping of resources, and I mean, that's nonprofit industrial complex, right? We get put in these, it's the nature of like funding and funding scarcity, and that it really creates that divide between organizations who should be in alignment with one another and supporting one another. And so I'm really fortunate that, you know, in my year and a half with QLaw, almost 2 years, year and a half with QLaw, it's like, I think that the organizations that we work with are really interested. I've just seen a big shift in how folks are working with one another around, it's a lot of resource sharing between us and our partners and information sharing. I think that urgency and the speed that session moves makes it really hard for us to pause, really defer to community and pull community members in. And that's the part that I feel like, you know, there are a lot of voices that are trying to advocate for that to happen, but it's a slow process to get that to happen. But, you know, part of our involvement in, you know, learning about the Keep Our Care Act is because of the folks over at the ACLU that we partner with, and Pro-Choice Washington and Planned Parenthood Alliance advocates. But the whole reason we're in those spaces in the first place, Denise can speak to a little bit, is because there were missing voices after the overturning of Roe. So do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure, I'll say a little bit, but I also just want to kick it to Atlas and Lee, because I think, you know, when the Dobbs decision came out, which overturned Roe v. Wade and really put onto states the ability to decide what we do with our bodies, right? And I think, you know, there are some who will say, oh, it only impacted this very narrow kind of healthcare reproductive decisions. I tend to see it as sort of part and parcel to all of the shifts that we've seen over policing ourselves, what we do on the streets, right? What we do going about our business in our communities, what we do in our doctor's office, what we do in our gender. I love the word that you used for gender liberation. I haven't heard that term before, and it's really beautiful. Like, what do we do with our gender liberation, right? And what do we have the ability to do within the constrictions of state law? And I saw, you know, I think when people feel afraid, they tend to, we pill bug, right? So we pull our resources in, we pull our connections in, and we operate from a very fear-based place. And I think that what our moments demand of us is to open up and connect and be with each other. Because the legislative session and its quickness, and it's like, we're going to have a committee hearing about this, we're going to talk about these technical details, you have to understand these technical details very quickly, right? That is all incremental and short-term technicalities to solving problems that are long-term problems. And long-term problems require long-term relationships. So I'll stop there, and I'm curious, you know, how you two have felt since the Dobbs decision came down, and how you've seen the sort of networks around you respond to that, if it feels like it's impacting what you're doing.
Yeah, personally speaking, I was not directly impacted by this decision outside of like, oh, okay, so now it is not a question. If we need to commit crime, we will be committing the crime.
Right.
Like, no questions asked. We don't need to have this conversation. I think that's the main point that it solidified for me. It's like, okay, yeah, like when in need, just step into action and understand that it's going to feel a little bit more uncomfortable than it has, but also my body as it is isn't being directly mandated in this decision. The trickle-off effects, if I don't do anything and if I don't get active, will, because it's giving precedent to like, well, the people were all right when we said that you can't do this and that we control what it is that the rest of your life has. So let's fuck with more lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think that and you know, that was a really difficult decision to sort of sit through, and I think we saw it coming for a long time. And for me, it was so much more than fair and equitable access to abortion, because let's be real, in so many places, including parts of Washington, like even if Roe v. Wade was encoded in law, there have been so many attacks over since '73 to make it more and more difficult for people to access abortion, and that we know disproportionately impacts poor people, BIPOC people, disabled people, et cetera. But really what I took away from that is, there's broader issues around individual autonomy and agency that tie back into an individual person's ability to make their best choices for their own bodies. And I think that there are other issues that are starting to come up now that people didn't necessarily connect to abortion access, such as so many queer families rely on IVF or other types of like medical family planning to be able to have children. And now we're seeing like that could become increasingly difficult for folks to access. So plus just the ways that could have ripple effects towards other aspects of healthcare, whether it's gender affirming care or just your ability to make choices around a certain type of medical treatment or so many other aspects of the very complex like healthcare system.
Right, yeah. And I think too, it was interesting to see the decision around Dobbs in the context of the decision around vaccine mandates, right? Where vaccine mandates were being very frequently struck down as infringements on individual rights, right? Even though the impact, if you don't get vaccinated, if you don't wear a mask, right, the impact is on your whole community, right? Anybody who you might breathe next to in the grocery store. Whereas, we have this desire to control what people do with their reproductive systems, whether it's accessing gender liberation care, whether it's, choosing to have a child or not have a child, choosing to access your ability to get pregnant or not, right? Like that decision impacts you, right? Like I have a 16-year-old, that impacts my family, right? How I raise him up to be in the world impacts my community, but his existence impacts me and my family, right? That was my body and my decision. And so it's just interesting to see that juxtaposition.
Yeah. And to bring it back to needs that y'all are seeing in the community, can you envision our communities like being able to put collective energy into addressing those needs? And in what ways do you see that being a possibility if you do?
The other, the previous PCLAC meeting that we were having, you were talking about PACs, about essentially like being able to have a bigger voice and a bigger, like a more of an impact within the legislative space tied to like backers and tied to like funding. And that was the first time that I had connected. I was like, oh wait, my dream is to have industry. The reality is that I'm too busy having to solve the problems that the government has given up on or just rolled over to nonprofits. And I'm like, okay, well I'm pretty busy. I don't want to start a business. But if that business can then give money to a PAC to then fund my interests in terms of like what communities' needs are and what we need to see in the legislature, that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me in the terms of like, oh yeah, like that is one way in order to mobilize existing businesses or folks who would like to get into business to be able to move their own interests in the same way that's being done against us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you bring that up, and I'm just exploring like what a PAC is, which is a political action committee.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a C4 status versus the 501c3 status that our current nonprofit and many other nonprofits have and maintain. But yeah, it brings it back to what I had mentioned earlier, where not all voices weigh equally at the legislature when it comes to passing bills. And it's infuriating to know, I was brought to tears listening to some folks, in the housing bill hearing share their experience and be so vulnerable, and to just hear the corporate greed in the room and to know that that is what won folks over. Same thing when it came to healthcare. And it was infuriating to know like that healthcare bill was the only pro-choice bill we had this session in Washington State. And so, yeah, I'm frustrated and trying to figure out like, how can if this is the system we have, how can we, arm our community with the tools they need to be successful? So I'm exploring, if our voices don't weigh equally, how can we make them weigh equally? And so that's one avenue I'm exploring, but I am curious, bringing it back to like the community member level, where do you see avenues for organizing or having voice? And You know, do you see that collective energy to address needs happening or being a possibility?
You know, I think it's a really difficult question. I think part of why it's difficult is that you're talking about extremely complex systems, and trying to seek out like a singular answer like feels really difficult for me. And I think there's just a lot of factors to galvanizing community support, especially around nonprofit-led initiatives, and also knowing that the legislative process is in some ways intentionally convoluted to keep community members from being able to engage and respond to the rapid fire pace of that process. On the other side, I do see in my community spaces I occupy, like more and more people becoming concerned. The legislation that's happened at the city, state, and national level, and the way that it further impacts disenfranchised folks over the past couple of years has, I think, kind of shaken some conscience like into people. And I think, you know, it's difficult to know how to harness that energy. I think that ultimately, actually one of the best ways to harness it is for like nonprofits or legislative advocacy groups to hold more space for a multiplicity of voices and a multiplicity of strategies.
Sorry, I'm thinking.
No, please.
I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking as well. For me, this is something that I was thinking of last year. It's like, as I was, last year was my first session, and then it ended in April, and we go into what's called the interim, and it's like, for me, I was ready to hit the ground running in the interim and like really try to connect with community members and bring these community members to talk with legislators and like, what bills do we need to craft, and let's have QLaw draft a bill with community, and it didn't happen, and because we have burnout amongst our community members and burnout amongst our community organizations that we partner with, and so it was harder to like pull folks together to really sit down often with community members too, and like hear what are the pressing needs that we need to like prepare for in going into session. And we went into yet another session where I had to look for the bills other folks had filed and identify the ones that were going to impact or support our communities. But I want to do it differently, right? And like I want to use this time and like this energy and frustration I have that we did not pass our most essential bills to figuring out like I'm not done with that housing bill yet, and that how can I actually bring folks together, because this affects every single community, and it's just mind-blowing to me that these two critical bills didn't pass. And I don't love this system that we have to engage. I am like so committed to trying to figure out how to like really amplify the community voice in it.
I think of conversations that I've had with folks who sit on boards for housing-led initiatives that will state, with genuine curiosity, I don't think it's malicious, I don't understand the link between poverty and houselessness and homelessness and being queer and trans. And I'm like, oh, we have so many issues. Okay, do we start there? And at the same time, like, you had mentioned burnout being in our community as well as in our nonprofit organizations and partners who we do this work with. And so often the trauma is current, it's compounded. So to even get to, I've been thinking about like, what is it that we want to bring towards community being on PCLAC, being on this advisory board? It's been going into our second year, and it's not until now that I'm like, oh, I think it would be super helpful to have an eviction protection while going through gender liberation processes, because honestly, it's expensive for homelessness, it's expensive for the city, all around expensive. If you just put a pause on this, you'll get your money, because that person still has to be housed, they still have to work and operate within this system that confines them to affordable housing when it's not really affordable, or maybe they will still need to be on their, what is it called? Medicaid, and forcing them to live under poverty means. So it's like, what I'm saying is that it takes a ridiculous amount of time to be able to sit down and have the luxury of like, what do I not want to be affected by, while I'm currently being affected by X, Y, and Z. And as someone who works within the nonprofit system, I don't want to bring anyone else in. This is not fun. It's horrible to have to make decision after decision that claims to make the biggest impact while also negating communities and not seeing them and putting one over the other. I think that it's really important that we're in different levels of our community so that we can speak truth to mutual aid and networks within and around King County that are currently doing the work. We don't need another nonprofit to say, yes, you can do this. No, you cannot do this. This funding is only meant for this. I need more getting out of the way.
I think you bring up something that kind of gets us to our final question for y'all. But you know, what do our community organizations who engage in this kind of work, like legislative advocacy, need to know to actually support building solidarity across communities? And in asking that question, it was brought up in my mind, like, oh, good timing for this, because as you're mentioning the ongoing harm people are subjected to in trauma actively, right? I think about, you know, in this last interim, we brought a community member to talk to a legislator about a need that impacted her, and the legislator had to say that, oh, this isn't a good time to like prioritize this. And it's like, I was so hurt for this person, this community member. It's like, that's how the game is played, right? That was a possible outcome of that conversation. And I almost regret it, because it puts this person who's already been impacted having to relive that trauma again and then be told to their face that this issue isn't important right now by somebody in power. And yeah, I think in what you're sharing is like, yeah, I'm keeping that in mind as I think about like, what are safer ways to engage community members where it's like not also drawing from their capacity and building it instead. So yeah, bringing it to that last question, like what else do community organizations like QLaw need to know to support and build solidarity across different communities?
I have a couple of different thoughts on this, and I think this is one of those questions where it's easier to sit and share what I think than it is to operationalize solutions. So I'm totally, aware of that. But I think organizations, nonprofits really need to listen and center the voices of the communities that they serve. And with that, also work on repair for harms that have happened historically. Understand and acknowledge that donor needs and values and community needs and values aren't in alignment, and that you're not doing a good job if you're not fighting for your community over your donors. And also, I think on working on engagement strategies, like we saw with the strippers, our workers, to engage more privileged members of the community who are resourced in different ways, don't struggle with survival needs in the same ways, and also like money is power in our society, and have more access to wealth to support the work of nonprofits, to support a PAC and support nonprofit employee wages and all these other things that can decrease burnout, or get another employee like working on a critical project or something like that. And so those are just, again, like knowing that this is like proposing almost the impossible in a lot of ways. But like, yeah, these are just some of the things that I think nonprofits can do or know to try to like build more community support, more coalition building, et cetera.
And I know you mentioned that it's not like what the very first thing that pops up in terms of operationalizing this is showing up. So I have a really great I guess, privilege. Yeah, that's what I'll say. It's a really great privilege to work at an organization that leads by community experiences and community design. I say that for the nonprofit where my main work happens, as well as where I advise on the Community Action Board and Advisory Board. And a lot of that is really just showing up. You get to learn so much more, and you really are able to not drain an individual, or I forgot what term you had used, but it's like you're not asking more of them, you're just simply showing up and observing, and in that fashion you really are able to equip yourself with, oh, these are what the community needs are, and then I can pursue these because I have a little bit more energy or just bandwidth to be here while you are still experiencing this. I think oftentimes what I'll see in nonprofits is that there is one community liaison and that's it. There's more than one community. And like Lee was saying, not everyone experiences disadvantages in the same way.
Right.
You know, I think about the luxury that I had over the last 2 years to figure out what it meant to be a squatter because I don't have children. My proximity to whiteness and the way that I speak will allow me to get really far with people who are white. Because what is the word? Astute. I don't know. They like to use these words where I'm like, racism is working in my favor. Okay.
You're very articulate.
That's the word. You're articulate. And I was present at Housing and Homelessness Advocacy Day, where there was a community member speaking about her experiences, and she had children. So at the moment that you receive an eviction letter, you don't get to play like, how much time do I get to spend here? Let me focus if this has been filed with King County legal system. No, what I experienced growing up is like, okay, I gotta get another plan, we gotta get into another home, we gotta move this out before this ends, because that will be more of a deterrent than what is going on right now. And so I had a really, really great experience to be able to like, well, this is all make-believe, and I know that my ability to succeed and to get more money in this make-believe society is at a higher rate than those around me, so I'm just gonna fuck around and find out. Not everyone experiences disadvantages at the same time, so like for me to be able to sit here and say, I fucked around and found out with my rent for 1.5 years is not everyone's story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I feel like that needs to be the name of our community advisory board. I think they hesitated to be like PCLAC because our group of 7 individuals in our organization on the community advisory board, we're in the process of coming up with a new name.
A rebrand.
A new name, a rebrand, because PCLAC is for Pandemic Civil Legal Aid Advisory Committee, and it's long. And Denise has made jokes about turning it into the fuck around and find out brigade. So yeah, I think those are the notes to end on, is that like we are interested in doing just that with our community in whatever way is possible, and I want to shoulder that work. But yeah, I just want to thank our community advisory board members for joining us, because yeah, they're our big main connection to community, and that's needed to move this needle, even if at the slow pace it moves. So thank y'all for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
So many things. Yeah, so if you want to find us, you can find us at QLawFoundation.org. So QLawFoundation.org. We are on Instagram, we are on Facebook. And so that's QLaw Foundation on Instagram and Facebook. Denise, what's on our horizon?
Let's see, and LinkedIn too. We're on LinkedIn, although I forget to update it sometimes.
That's news to me.
I think other things coming up, we'll be around in Pride season, doing lots of things. And so we'll be in lots of local areas doing Prides. And I think we're, let's see, we have a little fundraiser coming up on March 25th. So if you're a trivia head, the Geeks Who Drink Trivia Squad will be benefiting QLaw on March 25th in Ballard. And then also our annual fundraiser, which is, I'm proud to say, as you know, one of the only 20-ish, 30% of lawyers on our team is a party that you will want to bring your non-lawyer friends to. Our annual fundraiser will be September 27th this year. So, and I just, I think throughout the year, what we're working on is, not, you said something earlier about sort of many ways to get to, many ways to create engagement and to get to engagement. And I think that's something that we're always looking to, right? Is that like, there's so many paths to the destination of healing our communities and meeting the basic needs of our communities so that we can like flourish and be our full selves. And we are joining movements and really finding our lane in the ways that we can to support the work that our communities are already doing, right? I mean, our communities are brilliant. We're brilliant. And so it's just our honor to be able to say, okay, so we're brilliant members of our communities who know how to like file a lawsuit and talk to a legislator and figure out when the committee hearing is. But that's only part of the brilliance in our communities. And there's so many paths to that same destination. So.